Through a Scottish Prism, the programme that is unapologetically pro-Scottish independence and anti-Westminster rule. Everything we say here is viewed through a Scottish prism. Brought to you by Barhead Boy.
Hi folks, and welcome back to Through a Scottish Prism midweek specials. I hope yours are well. Great to have you back. Got a great friend of the show coming on just now, an ex-ambassador, given the clue away already, an author, a journalist, a campaigner, and an all-round good egg as well as a whisky connoisseur, none other than Craig Murray. Craig, how are you, my friend? Nice to see you.
Very well, thank you, Bertie. Very well.
Good. And are you recovered from your trip, or are you still a wee bit jet-lagged?
No, I'm fine now. I was jet-lagged for a few days, but I'm back in this time zone now.
Yeah. Good. Well, just before you left, you gave us the pleasure of your company and what you were hoping to do when you got there. So tell us, did it live up to your expectations, or did it shatter your dreams? How did it go?
I think it went a bit better than I expected. I wasn't quite sure what reaction we would get from the decolonization committee, particularly because, especially from the UN Secretariat side, the UN's rather seen its job as working its way through the list of colonies and striking them off, getting rid of each problem one by one. And the Chagos Islands, for example, has now just come off the list because that's been resolved. And they've been looking to, if you like, wind up the work of the committee. And they've been resistant to adding new non-self-governing territories to the list for some time. So I was expecting some sort of institutional resistance, if you like. But in fact, I found it much more open and willing to think about it and consider what we're saying to them. And on a personal basis, very welcoming. It wasn't a difficult environment to be operating in.
I did see that you ended up a party of the Russian ambassador to the UN.
I did indeed. In fact, I had a 45-minute one-on-one with the Russian ambassador to the UN discussing Scottish independence, which is quite an achievement. I mean, I promise you, John Swinney couldn't get a 45-minute one-on-one with the UN.
He couldn't get a 45-minute with his own party.
Probably too. Probably not of his own siblings, but they. And I went to several other diplomatic receptions, including a British one, which I gate crashed. But I did spend some time at social events because they're good places to nobble people and talk to them. I had a very, very good conversation, for example, with the Serbian ambassador to the UN at the Russian function. And the Serbian ambassador remembered Alex Salmond as standing against the NATO bombing of Serbia.
Unpardonable folly.
You never exactly, and you never know, what's going to come up and where the good things done by some of us before us are going to be helpful again. So, yeah, it was very strange sense because, of course, it's just like being back in my old job again in exactly the same métier, only lobbying for something more worthwhile.
Yeah, but we should also, as you say, the good things are remembered, but the bad things would also be remembered. So we should all be on our guard.
That's true, but I mean, one thing which is very definitely true and came over very strongly is the UK is just not popular at all. It's not at all popular at the United Nations, which is probably unsurprising. And it's, of course, true in general in that it's the former colonial power for an awful lot of the nations at the UN. And the days when there was colonial nostalgia have rather passed, and people do now rather more think of the think realistically of and are learning more of the exploitation of their country
Yeah.
by the British. The colonial narrative has worn off. Let me put it that way. And on top of which, of course, Britain has just massively slashed its aid budget, which has impacted a lot of countries and is not popular at all. And of course, the UK is one of the prime countries aiding and abetting the genocide in Gaza, which, as far as the global south is concerned, is the big issue of the moment. So the unpopularity of the United Kingdom was again makes it very fertile ground to spread a message about breaking up the United Kingdom. So again, in terms of planting the seed, getting people to give me a hearing and listen to what I'm saying, be willing to consider the subject, it was good. But I don't want to exaggerate. I'm very worried about raising unrealistic expectations of things happening extremely quickly, because due bluntly largely to the SNP, people in the independence movement have had so many expectations dashed that I'm not sure how many more dashed expectations people can stand. So I'd much rather, in a sense, people were surprised when we suddenly make progress very well, than for me to keep saying, yeah, this is going to go fast, it's going to go brilliantly, and then we don't achieve that. So I'm being a little cautious and conservative in my in my estimation of the way forward.
Now, you said you had 45 minutes with the Russian ambassador. Did they sound they'd be supportive of our claim?
I mean, obviously, the Russian ambassador needs to report back to Moscow and get Moscow's view on it, because, and in fact, pretty well every state will need to do that. But there are one or two ambassadors to the UN who are so senior in the government of their host country that if you get their support, that pretty well guarantees the support of their capital. But that's not going to be the case for 98% of countries. But the Russian ambassador asked to see the documentation, which we have sent to the Russians, the extensive documentation on why Scotland is a colony, including Alf Beard's work on colonial markers, including, of course, Professor Robert Black's amazing paper for the SSRG conference. We've sent the paperwork to the Russians, and they are looking at it. But I mean, the session was very friendly. Could not have been more friendly.
Yeah, I remember before you left, when we had a chat, you were saying, people have to realise, as you're, confirming again today, this isn't a quick fix. It's not a magic wand, and that we still have to keep doing we have to prove to the world that we as a people do want independence. And the only way to do that, I think, the only way we can show that happening is at the ballot box, election after election. Would you agree with that?
I think that's true. I mean, we need to show it at the ballot box, but then we need to actually move on and declare independence. The way forward is this. If we get support from the Committee of 24, which is the Decolonization Committee, and they're the people who I was meeting there. I was at a meeting, I was at successive meetings of the Decolonization Committee discussing various colonies. Now, I'll talk about those meetings in a moment. And I was meeting members of that committee in the margins and also talking to the secretariat of that committee. If we can get the Committee of 24 to recommend to the General Assembly to adopt us as a non-self-governing territory, as a colony, and we then get a vote at the General Assembly which confirms that and puts us on the list, that removes the capacity of the United Kingdom to veto independence at the Security Council. Because the reason it's set up that way is obvious, in that the majority of the colonies which were initially on the agenda of the Committee of 24, of the Decolonization Committee, the majority of those colonies were owned by Britain and France. So you couldn't have a system where Britain or France would veto their independence. That would make a mockery of the entire process. So the process for which we're aiming is to go first from a Committee of 24, a recommendation from them to the General Assembly that we should be adopted, and then adoption by the General Assembly. You can actually do it the other way around. You could go for a resolution at the General Assembly adopting us as a non-self-governing territory and then referring the matter to the Committee of 24. But just tactically, if you can get the Committee of 24 on side first, and bluntly, if you asked me to pick the membership of the Committee of 24, I don't think we would come up with a more favourable committee than we've already got. It's an extremely favourable committee to us. Then I think that route has the greatest chance of success. I apologise. This is slightly technical and dull talking about committees, but that's how we have to do
I think the people of Scotland need to hear it exactly, because I don't know if you've noticed, Craig, but I've seen a lot of people saying, well, that's it, I'm finished with voting, I'm finished with politics, I'm just going to wait. And Sarah and Salvo bringing independence from the UN, and you're going, it's not as simple as that, guys.
It's not. It will take time, and then what you need at the other end is we need to win an election with independence parties which are going to be prepared to say, in the Scottish Parliament, we have won the election and the Scottish Parliament is declaring independence regardless of what Westminster thinks, because that's the end goal. I personally believe that Westminster will never agree, that they will never agree to another referendum, they will never agree to accept independence. So we have to do this without Westminster agreement, which means we have to declare independence, and then we have to get recognised at the United Nations. And what I'm handling, if you like, or what we at Liberation Scotland are handling, is the UN end of that equation. But that doesn't mean that we don't need the winning the election here and declaring independence part of the equation. But the two are inseparable.
Hand in hand.
They go hand in hand. Yeah.
So in fact, you're getting rid of the roadblock, and the political side is to drive through what was a roadblock.
That's exactly right. It stands to reason that the UK should not be able to veto our independence. We have the right of self-determination under the UN Charter. You cannot have the right of self-determination and be able to have that right blocked by another people. If that were true, you would not have the right of self-determination. It would be a logical impossibility. It should be noted, a logical impossibility that you believe in the Scottish right of self-determination and you also believe that we must have permission from Westminster. If you believe that, you don't actually believe in Scottish self-determination. And that's what I'd say to my colleagues in the SNP, my friends who are still in the SNP. I say to them, your party has got to stop acknowledging and believing that Westminster has a veto. Because if you believe Westminster has a veto, you do not actually believe in Scottish independence. You do not believe we are a nation with the right of self-determination. You in fact have a colonial mindset. You think you need permission from your master to do anything. You've got to shake that off. And we've got to stop voting for people who have no object in mind other than to go down on their knees for permission from their colonial masters.
Yep, I agree wholeheartedly. That's what we're going to do. But if I could go back, just the vote that they have in the General Assembly, it's just a simple majority we need in there. It's not, again, the UK-US couldn't veto a simple majority. It's just a simple majority vote, yes?
That's an interesting question, because there's not really a very direct precedent for what we're attempting to do, which is to to use the General Assembly to overcome a possible attempted veto by going the Decolonization Committee route. And I think it is arguable we would need a 2/3 majority. But on the other hand, I don't think that's a problem, because I don't think we'd have any difficulty getting the 2/3 majority. In the sense, if we can get a simple majority, we can get a 2/3 majority. Because we would only do this with the support of the global South. There are some other factors to this, which I think it's important people understand.
Right.
I was welcomed very much by, if you like, the Bolivarian movements of South America. I was very warmly welcomed by the Nicaraguans, by Venezuela, by those countries, which and by Cuba. By, if you like, the revolutionary movements of South America, the anti-colonial movement, and also by the anti-colonial movement of Africa. And those are the people who are to be our allies. We are working this by registering at the UN as a colony, and that makes us a liberation movement. We are looking to be acknowledged as a liberation movement to the UN. And we were there expressing solidarity with other liberation movements. That's why this was an important part of the process. We were showing solidarity by making speeches in favor of the liberation of the Kanak people of New Caledonia, for example, and in favor of the liberation from colonialism of the population of French Polynesia. So that entails a series of anti-colonial beliefs and attitudes. And New Caledonia is a good example. In the discussion on every one of the colonies being discussed, they all had their equivalent of our Scottish Unionists there giving their side of the story. And when it came to New Caledonia, you had the native people talking of the arrests, the imprisonments, the historic injustices, the extreme poverty, the alcoholism, the deprivation of land, and the fact that the main industry of New Caledonia, the nickel industry, almost entirely excludes local people from influence, from any say in the governance of that, and increasingly from even any kind of employment in it. But then you had people representing the colonists. You had bluntly white people, fat white people who were quite wealthy, talking about how this terrible independence movement was disrupting the activity of their nickel mines and damaging their profits, and how this was very bad because, of course, if they made a profit, that was good for the entire island, blah, blah. So, you had the equivalent of our unionists, if you like, there. You had the colonists there arguing their point of view. And it's fair to say that the committee, with the possible exception of Morocco and Western Sahara, that's a different matter for different politics. But the default of the position of the committee is not to support the colonists. The entire purpose of the committee is decolonization. But in every case, more or less, there is a story of multinational companies and colonial companies exploiting the natural resources of the country with insufficient benefit going to the indigenous people, which is exactly the situation we have here in Scotland, of course.
Yeah.
We have seen our industries hollowed out and eroded to the benefit of multinational corporations, which close down, say, our aluminium industry, or close down Grangemouth when it's convenient to them. Or we have the multinationals that have taken over our whiskey industry, which use transfer pricing in order to take all the profit away from Scotland, and who ship all their whiskey out through English ports, not Scottish ports. So we are actually in the same position. We actually really do have so much in common with these other indigenous liberation movements. But here's a point I want to come to. People have to understand that we are aligning ourselves with left-wing, anti-globalist, anti-neoliberal liberation movements. That's where we are, and that's the political stance necessitated if this particular course of action is going to succeed. And I know there are people who are genuinely independent supporters who are actually fairly right-wing in economic terms, who are neoliberal or globalist. And that may be difficult for them. But this approach may make it quite hard to keep the entire movement together behind it when it is of necessity an anti-colonial, anti-neoliberal approach, if that makes sense.
Yeah, they sound my type of guys anyway. I'm definitely my cup of tea. But I understand exactly what you're saying. What sort of timescales do we?
Sorry, just to finish up. I don't think that's a problem for the large majority of independent supporters. I think we tend to be against the multinationals. I think we tend to understand the exploitation of our own country. And I think we do tend to sympathise with the native people of places like New Caledonia rather than the colonists. But there are some, particularly in the SNP, of course. I can't imagine Angus Robertson or John Swinney being very keen with this liberation movement approach, this anti-multinational industry approach, for example.
It's hard seeing them in favour of independence, period. Those two you mentioned, but that's just, you know what I mean? What sort of timescales are we talking about in this to get to the General Assembly vote, for example, Craig?
I would put a timescale on it of 2 to 3 years, but I'm being deliberately cautious. Right. But I would be hoping to do it in 2 to 3 years, but it could go much quicker than that, right. Depending simply on the reception we get and how quickly. I think we already do have countries, and I'm not going to name which because it would be premature, but I think we already do have the first necessity, which is a state sponsor. You need one country willing to actually raise it at the committee and say, I want Scotland to be on the agenda in order to get discussion of the committee. And I think we've already crossed that border. I'm pretty certain that we have one country at least willing to do that at the committee. But you don't want to do that until you've made sure that you've got enough of other members who are going to come in and vote for you. So that doesn't include other lobbying. But that first important step, which is a very major one. And I should say as well that I should explain that partly the reason we've got to that stage already is that there are a lot of excellent American activists in particular, but also activists from other nations as well, political activists, I mean, who are based in New York, who know the diplomats from the liberation countries, who view them as fellow activists and fellow campaigners, and who I know as well, and who were prepared to vouch for me. So I was being introduced to people, to some of these diplomats from some of these key liberation struggle countries, by seasoned, famous American activists saying, "Oh, this is Craig. He's a friend of mine. He's a good man. You should support him. You can trust him." So that also was an extremely helpful means of getting into this.
Did you want to boost the tourism of this country? Would you like to name the country that said that they will sponsor us? Or would you rather not?
As I say, I think it's premature. I think it's premature. It's a country. It's a name I've actually used already earlier, but I'm not going to say precisely which one.
But when you're able to tell it, we can boost their tourism. I would imagine there'll be a lot of Scots will decide they want to go there on holiday.
That's very true, and it's a very good place to go on holiday.
Yeah, we should actually maybe organise a Scotland International, send the Tartan Army in. They're probably our best diplomatic corps that we've got is the Tartan Army. So I'm really glad to see that you're enthusiastic and positive in all this. You have painted some caveats, and people shouldn't think this is going to happen next week. But just to stress, we've also got to keep working in the day-to-day business of getting the people behind the movement. Would you say that's fair?
Extremely important, and in infusing people. And where I think this dual approach is very helpful is it helps give people hope that something is going to happen as a result of it. Because what we saw at the general election was, the vast majority of independent supporters just didn't bother to vote. They sat on their asses at home, and you can't blame them because, why would you bother? Why would you go out and vote for the SNP when it's going to do nothing whatsoever to bring independence any closer? Whereas if you can show people something is actually happening and that independence is possibly achievable in let's say a 3-year time frame, realistically, if they get out and vote for independence, that will infuse people, that will get the vote out, that will infuse young people in particular, and especially younger people often quite interested in institutions like the United Nations and how they work. So this is great in a sense because it not only is it a dual approach to the process of achieving independence, it also feeds back into campaigning and gives a story we can tell in campaigning that this is how we're going to do it, this is how we're going to get independence. So it's a win-win in that sense.
Yeah. Would you also say that, we'll go there later maybe in our conversation, but the things that are going on in the world just now, the very scary things, that the British are all on the wrong side, that's got to be helping our cause, isn't it? And turning more nations against them, and it will improve our chances at the United Nations.
Very much so. There's no doubt about it. There's never been a greater period, I think, of alienation between the majority of countries, the global South in particular, and the Western powers. And some of the Western powers, like Spain or Ireland or Norway, haven't lost their senses. But the UK and US and Germany are behaving utterly like rogue states. They seem to have abandoned the entire principle of international law, which doesn't go down well with the international institutions. And we have Starmer today saying that we have to prepare for strikes against the UK. Well, no, maybe we should just try and avoid annoying people to the extent they want to strike the UK. Not that I believe anybody does. I mean, plainly, this is more crazy hyperbole from sort of warmongering from Starmer, and more of an excuse to clamp down on civil liberties at home. But the behaviour, the febrile behaviour of the UK, definitely has annoyed and angered the international community. The United Kingdom is extremely unpopular, and the idea of breaking up the United Kingdom appeals to people in a way it wouldn't do if the UK was still a respected nation internationally. But it's not anymore. It's just not.
And it's not a recent thing. That's been developing over years. Now, for the people watching, Craig, what can they do to assist this whole thing? What can they do? Their little bit.
I think the most important thing that people can do individually is speak to others, and particularly others within the independence movement, funnily enough, but not only that, and explain to them why Scotland is a colony. Because one of the problems we still have is those people who have an innate resistance to the idea of Scotland being a colony. And there seem to be two perhaps opposite angles to that. You have people who don't like to think Scotland's a colony out of pride. Oh, we were never conquered. We're a proud nation. We took over England. We're not a colony. And then on the other hand, and the people who annoy me particularly are the people who say, oh, of course, Scotland's not a colony. Scotland had an equal share of colonial guilt, and they were Scottish slave owners, and you're just trying to absolve us of the guilt of colonialism.
Slavery.
And neither of those are helpful narratives in terms of going forward, because plainly Scotland is a colony. It meets all the signs of colonial exploitation, including transfers of wealth, clearances of indigenous people, lack of autonomy in major decisions regarding defence, foreign affairs, the judiciary, monetary policy. But the talk I gave to the Committee on New Caledonia, I stated that New Caledonia has no say in defence, foreign policy, monetary policy, or ultimate control of the judiciary. And all those things are, of course, true of Scotland, which answers to a Supreme Court in London and has no effective say on foreign defence policy. In fact, the vast majority of Scots at the moment are radically opposed to English foreign and defence policy. There's no doubt about that at all, but there's nothing we can do about it.
Well, I call it an offence policy. It's not a defence policy, but offence. Right. But the one thing I've noticed as well, I'm not, most of the people watching this podcast, I'm no great fan of the BBC, but I do have to take off my hat, and I've done it before, and I'll say it again publicly to Martin Geisler, because every time he gets a unionist in front of him, he asks them the same question, which is it a joint or voluntary union? And of course, the union, it's a joint voluntary union, absolutely. And he says, so how does Scotland, get out of the union? All people aren't interested in that, is the usual stock answer. They want to talk about jobs and the economy, because the unionists actually don't want to talk constitution, do they, Craig? They want to stick to jobs and economy and currencies and EU and NATO and things like that, because on the constitution, they're on shaky ground, we're on strong ground.
There's no doubt about that. They're desperate to avoid another referendum because they know they would lose. There's no doubt they would lose. If you look what happened last time, we started at 32% and we ended up at 45%, because during the course of the campaign, people actually got a chance to think and hear about Scottish independence, and the fact that actually it would be a great deal better in terms of jobs and the economy, not just in terms of our behaviour as a state internationally. Unionists are just desperate to avoid the subject and desperate to avoid giving people the choice.
Yeah, they don't want to talk about independence because it's, as I say, they know that they've got no answer to it. So the question was, what can they, apart from talking to people, is there anything can they write to the UN? Can they write to someone? Is there anyone they can get in touch with to try and add weight to what you guys are doing?
I don't think at the moment there's anything we're doing which will be added weight to by a raft of numbers, sort of letter writing campaign, for example. I don't think we're at a stage where that's particularly helpful. What is helpful is if people join Liberation Scotland. That definitely is something you can usefully do. And I believe there is a petition you can you can sign. I must confess, I'm obviously I'm allied with and working with the people who launched the petition, but I'm not certain that has enormous use. I don't think it's something that's particularly going to impress the UN. But certainly, what we need more members, and getting as many members as we can would be very useful. And we're looking, for example, to hold an event at the United Nations in Geneva in the autumn, which would include holding a social event to which we invite UN delegates to the Geneva headquarters of the UN. And on that occasion, we'll be looking for volunteers to come out and help host and talk to people, for example. So there will be occasions going forward where we're calling on people to assist. But at the moment, people's individual energies are best spent campaigning for independence at home. The diplomatic side is not really something which benefits enormously from mass participation.
This thing in Switzerland, will there be gin and Ferrier Rocher available?
Well, I hope it'll be whiskey. I'm
Yeah,
actually,
well, I know you would. I'm just checking whether I'm going to volunteer or not here.
Whiskey is a great thing. We need to exhibit our culture and exhibit we are indigenous. And the one of the things which helps that way, for example, is that we have national symbols which have universal recognition. If you put on your kilt and your spartan, if someone plays the bagpipes, people all over the world, people know that is Scottish. Whereas I'm ashamed to say it, but I don't particularly know what the specific national dress of the Kanaks of New Caledonia is, for example. Making a show of our indigeneity and our difference at the UN would be a useful thing to do, for example. And even if that does go a bit down the shortbread tin and tartan route, that's still helpful. That's still emphasizing separate identity.
Yeah, and I should say, folks, as Craig's alluded to, we need to win elections and liberate Scotland. The party who are standing on independence, nothing else, support 100% what's happening in the UN and with liberation. And we could do with help as well to make that case for May next year and win a majority. And we can declare our independence from it if we get a victory. That's me. I had to get my wee plug in there, Craig. But to move on to, if I could move on slightly, because I know you're, like myself, you're very, shall I say, committed to what's happening in Western Asia, and particularly in Palestine. Do you see any end to that slaughter and horrific genocide that's happening there?
Very difficult to see an end. I mean, it's so institutionalized at the moment. At the moment, you have the situation where they've set up this kind of fake aid organization to distribute aid, and then they are deliberately and systematically killing between 50 and 100 people, queuing for aid every day. And it's this extraordinary combination of malnutrition, starvation, and then a kind of hull of the queue, which it's systematic genocide of a kind which I think is perfectly reasonable to compare to Nazi concentration camps. It's really absolutely appalling. I'm vaguely hopeful, trying to find reasons to hope. There's some sign, perhaps, that Trump may feel he has now fulfilled his obligation to the Zionist donors who gave him hundreds of millions of dollars for his election campaign. Today he said things which were highly critical of Israel and their continued bombing of Iran, most critical of Israel I've ever heard him. It may be that he viewed his bombing of the Iranian nuclear sites as the fulfillment of the debt, if you see what I mean. But he's, okay, you gave me all that money. I've now done that bombing for you. That's it. We're now square. I don't owe you anything anymore. And he may then stop supporting Israel so uncritically, and he may call a halt to the genocide in Gaza, because I believe the United States could call a halt to it by telling Israel it will simply withdraw its support if they continue. But that's the only really optimistic outlook I see in the near future. I do think it's very helpful that Iran has punctured the myth of Israel being totally invincible and military supermen who nobody can touch. I think it's important that was punctured. And it also, I hope, will have an effect across the Arab world where you have Arab rulers who kowtow to Israel and the United States and claim that they are unable to do anything else. Whereas, in fact, the course of Iran can inflict that level of damage upon Israel, so could the Arab states if they were to concentrate on that. So there may be long-term ramifications from the collapse of the image of the invincible Iron Dome and the fact that the Israelis are military supermen who can't be conquered. That may be part of the disintegration of Israel, and I don't think Netanyahu's policy of locking the Israeli people in and forbidding them to leave, using them as human shields, is going to increase the internal cohesion of Israel either. So I see reasons to be not entirely pessimistic in the long term, but none of this, I think, is going to save many Palestinians in Gaza in the short term. And what on earth Trump is going to do about Gaza and whether he's going to follow through on any of his earlier crazy ideas of moving the population and building condominiums, I don't know. My hope is he may well move away from that.
No, I mean, the thing about Iran, it took everyone's eye away from Palestine, and they just seemed to be increasing the killing. While everyone was watching what was going on with Iran, the Gaza was off the news cycle, and that was another tragedy.
And I think that was very largely the purpose of it. I think that's why Netanyahu attacked Iran, because there had been a change in tone from Western governments and Western media, which had finally seemed to be coming to acknowledge the atrocities in Gaza. And so Netanyahu moved to attack Iran to shift the narrative again and to again make these extraordinary claims of victimhood when Iran struck back, which no sensible person in the world would entertain, but which, of course, the mainstream media and the Western politicians all immediately got behind and started supporting Israel and talking complete and utter nonsense about imminent Iranian nuclear weapons.
Yeah, but the public, that's the thing, the public, I mean, I can think of 2 or 3 people, in fact, more than that. There was several things on social media where Israelis were complaining that they'd lost their house, it had been hit by a missile and they were homeless. And people who I would suggest are very demure, normally very, quiet, were saying, almost saying, hell, slap it into you, now you know how it feels. So there is a feeling by the public who are, they don't like it. The politicians might be pretending it's not happening, but the public are getting riled.
Well, that's the extraordinary thing. And something which I just can't think of any real parallel to in my lifetime, which is there's now a total disconnect on one of the biggest issues of the day, the genocide in Gaza, between the public and the politicians in the West. And that's all to do with, bluntly, the Israeli lobby buying people and possibly blackmailing people. But it does mean that there's this enormous frustration in the public who have no leverage to impose their will on the political class, who just do what they want, in effect. And I should say, I think the prescription of Palestine action may be, another one of these things where government's entirely out of line with public opinion, particularly public opinion in Scotland. I'm waiting to see what happens, because I'm not going to stop supporting Palestine action. And I'm arresting Craig Murray seems to be their go-to reaction to most problems in Scotland. So whether once it's prescribed they're going to immediately come in and arrest me, I don't know. I'm quite interested to
you must like the taste of porridge, Craig. Is that what it is?
Oh, the food's not bad at all in Stockton, actually.
I was going to ask you about this because, it seems ridiculous that you throw some paint on a plane and you're described a terrorist, killed 500,000 or helped to kill 500,000 Palestinians, and you're not prescribed a terrorist. It just doesn't match up, does it?
No, not at all. And we're sending aircraft. The FCO is organising aircraft. I understand the first flight or two has come back already to fetch back Israeli, British settlers from Israel because of a bombardment by Iran, many of whom are probably war criminals who have served in the IDF. And we're helping rescue people who've been committing genocide, while people have been protesting about the genocide we're calling terrorists. I mean, by this measure, there's no doubt the suffragettes would have been terrorists. The Greenham Peace Women would have been terrorists. It's crazy.
CND
would be terrorists. And it demeans the whole notion of terrorism. It's absolutely not.
Yeah, and of course, it's one step away. Now, this might sound, people saying, oh, behave yourself, Roddy. But how long before they then say, well, I'll tell you what, if you remember Applied Cymru, SNP, or the Yes Movement, or Yes Cymru, or Sinn Féin, you're terrorists. It's not a big step, is it?
Well, there's no doubt whatsoever that they regard Scottish nationalism as the biggest single threat to the United Kingdom. Mm-hmm. And we are already a major task for the security services. And it's not going to be long, I think, before elements of the existing Scottish nationalist, Scottish independence movement will start to be prescribed. And because they, as you say, they have set the bar. You don't have any longer to be committing violence to be prescribed as a terrorist organization. Nobody is even claiming that Palestine Action are committing violence, although I saw that the police were making an allegation, which I think is almost certainly totally untrue, that somebody from Palestine Action once attacked a policeman with a sledgehammer. My guess is that somebody with a sledgehammer who had gone in to damage a factory, a weapons factory on behalf of Palestine Action, was attacked by the police while he was holding the sledgehammer, is what I expect happened, but I don't know the details of the exact incident. But there's no doubt that Palestine Action have never, ever committed violence against people and have no interest in committing violence against people. So if you're now starting to describe organizations which do not commit violence as terrorists, then you're getting very close to prescribing some of the Scottish independence organizations. There was a protest against the opening of the new Scottish office complex in Edinburgh, just behind Waverley Station, at which I don't think it actually happened, but there was some discussion of smashing windows and that kind of thing. That could now get you prescribed as a terrorist organization. This is utterly crazy.
Yeah, but there is double standards. For example, you were talking about the British government through David Lammy or flying out British Israelis, getting them home safe, you're all right, possibly been in the IDF, some of them. And then we've got Shamima Begum, who was a 15-year-old schoolgirl who was groomed. Let's be honest, she was groomed and ended up, and she's had her citizenship stripped from her, and she's a stateless person. A 15-year-old child she was. It's ridiculous.
No, it's appalling. I mean, she's been treated appallingly, and that's just part of institutionalized Islamophobia, of which there's so much in the UK. And yes, it's a stark comparison. It's also interesting that nearly all these people have been flown out from Israel by David Lammy are dual citizen Israeli British nationals, but you had the situation in the Sudan a couple of years ago when the Sudan government collapsed and Khartoum fell to very dangerous rebel forces, where dual Sudanese British nationals, the British government were refusing to evacuate on the grounds they were Sudanese, which is the normal policy as regards dual nationals abroad, but you don't help dual nationals in their country of second nationality. And yet we're making an exception for the Israelis, despite the fact that they're part of a colonial settler enterprise which has turned genocidal.
Yeah, well, they should have been collecting the planes and dropping them in The Hague. That's what they should have been doing. Making them face charges. That's I tell you, in an independent Scotland, I'd like to see as an independent Scotland Foreign Secretary immediately giving Shamima Begum a passport and bringing the poor girl home to get closer to her family in England. I think it's just disgraceful what they've done to that wee girl. Craig, the clock's beating us as always. It always does. I just want to thank you. Is there any last words you've got for the public to give them some hope for independence and for the end of the slaughter?
Yeah, I think on the end of the slaughter, I do think that the sheer horror which has been aroused in the majority of people in the whole world, most people in the world have seen and are horrified by the genocide in Gaza. And I do think that will make it impossible for Israel to continue in its present state of existence. I do think that is ultimately going to bring about change. What I can't promise is, or predict, is that in any way it will bring about an early stop to the slaughter. On independence, I think what I will say to you is, please be very, very happy at the extent of international support for Scottish independence. The very idea of Scottish independence warms the hearts of a lot of people all around the globe, and even of seasoned diplomatic representatives who are excited by the idea of Scottish independence. There is a world there of states who are waiting for Scotland to join them as a state, and will be happy for Scotland to join them as a state. All we have to do now is our bit at home, but let's get out there and do it.
Yeah, as Lloyd says every week in our show, to see our flag between the flag of Saudi Arabia and Senegal outside the United Nations is something we should all look forward to. Yeah. Craig, as always, my dear friend, thank you very much for your time. I appreciate it. I know you're a busy, busy man. It's always a pleasure to talk to you, never a chore. Thank you.
Thank you, Donny. Bye.
And to you folks, we'll see you very, very soon. Till then, you and yours, please take care.
Through a Scottish Prism, the programme that is unapologetically pro-Scottish independence and anti-Westminster rule. Everything we say here is viewed through a Scottish prism. Brought to you by Barhead Boy.